Welcome to 30-Minute Reviews. I am Adam. Okay. So, let me just see if it's actually recording properly. It is. I can hear myself in my ears. Nice. So, let's discuss this week's big thing. And we got two movies coming up on this week's episode. We have Tron and Tron Legacy. Let's do Tron first, because I actually have copious amounts of notes on Tron. Movie notes, Tron. All right, let's see what we got. So I watched Tron. I've never seen Tron before. The only understanding I have of Tron is based on what happens in the Kingdom Hearts video games, because I played Kingdom Hearts 2. I played 3Ds. I've played all of the Kingdom Hearts games. So I have an understanding, an approximate understanding. I have an approximate understanding of what it was going into it, and it was basically guy goes into the digital world, meets Tron, and for the record, I did think Tron was going to be the main character. I was incorrect, but what are you going to do? First thing I noticed is how dated everything in this movie is. Not stylistically, but the effects and costuming look cheap. And this is important to note. This movie came out in the early 80s. I want to say it was 81 when this one came out. Here's the issue, though. It's not a bad thing. It's of its time, and it lends to the overall feel of the world. The costuming is the bigger concern. The costuming does look very cheap. It looks very padded. With you can see the foam in some places. It just doesn't look very good. The visual effects that go into the movie in terms of computer generated images, CGI, that looks dated as well. However, because it's a movie that's set in 1981, and because that's what it would have looked like, and this is the first real outing in this regard to do a very highly CGI movie, it makes sense for the movie to look the way it does. And I think that the further out we get from the original release of the movie, the more it's going to lend itself to the better it's going to look in a weird sense, where it's like we can look the other way towards it as we got further away, and it's like, okay, well, it's a product of its time, but now when you look back on it, it's kind of a time capsule in a way to what these graphics look like. And we'll talk more about that when we compare and contrast this with Tron Legacy, because that's part of what I think hurt Tron Legacy. Now, and the thing is, too, it's like CGI does get dated pretty quickly, and it's not like when CGI gets dated now, we don't look at it as like a time capsule. We don't look at it as an extension of the further out we get from its release, the better it's going to look. And something else that this movie really does well is the pitch of the movie. And it's one of the things, I actually saw a tweet about this today, completely unrelated to this, where it's like, when you watch a TV show, someone will be like, oh, you gotta watch like 3 seasons of it before it gets good. And there are a lot of TV shows, like Doctor Who, the reboot, you gotta kind of struggle through a lot of what happens with Eccleston's Doctor until you get like 6 episodes and then it gets good. You gotta sit through like a season, like almost a full season of Age of S.H.I.E.L.D. before you get to where it starts getting good. When they introduce the Inhumans. And like when we talk about this, when you talk about a movie, you want to hook in your audience from the beginning. You got to hook them in the first 5 pages. And that's what this movie does. It kind of launches you right into the digital world. The grid, I think it's called the grid in this movie. Where it's like, they also refer to it as Space Paranoids, because that was the game that he makes. And it very clearly sets up everything you need to know for this movie. It's a very simple plot using very high concepts. The Master Control Program runs everything, and he's been trying to make everything more efficient. His quest is for more knowledge. We know everything we need to know about this movie is set up very early on. And the other thing is, this movie is very obviously science fiction in the traditional sense. When you look at science fiction horror especially, like, say, Frankenstein, say, The Invisible Man, it's always, what is the worst thing we can do with this technology? What is the what's the point of no return for humanity? How does the increased use of technology influence humanity? And this movie very obviously has that critique. The bad guy, although whether or not he's actually an antagonist or not, he's antagonistic toward Flynn, the main character, because he stole Flynn's idea. But he's not so much the bad guy where the MCP is the bad guy. He's more. I wrote in my notes he's a compromat because he's a useful idiot for the MCP. It's a critique on the over reliance of people on computers because he's reliant on the MCP and the MCP is starting to take over the thought process for him and the MCP is taking over as we go. Now, when we're in the real world, we have a sense where it's like a lot of movies from this era use a similar view of science. Science. I'm thinking like The Black Hole, which we did last week. Very utilitarian, very kind of not quite dark, but very grayscale. And the reason why they do that is it drives down cost. And it looks interesting, and it's got a very futuristic design, kind of a cassette futurism kind of way of looking at it, but not really. When we enter space paranoid with Flynn, Jeff Bridges' character, we get to see how beautiful the game... Oh, yeah, the effects in this scene are fantastic. And I mean that in the best possible way. I'm not being sarcastic. It's dated. My parents have their wedding tape, and it was like 91, 92 when they got married. And on this wedding tape, they had transitions. And like the company that did it very obviously paid a lot of money for these transitions and wanted to use as much of them as they could in it. So like randomly in the middle of it, they got married in like July. Randomly in the middle of it, there's a Santa Claus transition because it's like computer generated and it looks cool. And they want to show off. It's kind of like here they were like, we're gonna go in. When he enters the world, we see like all the colors, and it's like everything in that scene is so awesome. I love that, the way that they did that. Now, and the reason why that everything looks so the effects are dated, it's made it more apparent because of how effects heavy the movie is. Contemporary science fiction movies at the time, like Star Wars, The Black Hole, and others, were very heavy in practical effects, be it using miniatures, like think Back to the Future, where there's minimal... In Back to the Future, there's minimal special effects, especially in the first one, where it goes back to 1950s, very minimal special effects. Star Wars, there's very minimal special effects, too, because there's laser fire, there's the lightsabers, but most of it's done with miniatures, with practical... Everything's basically practical. Flip it with today, where it's like when Attack of the Clones came out, that entire sequence in the Geonosis factory is entirely CGI. This is the first time that this has really happened, where we have CGI being used basically the entire way through the movie. Where was I? By the time we get to the point where physical effects and practical costumes are actually used, they stand out and they look kind of silly. And this is after the first time they do the light cycle fight. The light cycle fight. By the time we get to that point, they do have some practical costumes from some, some people who are living in the grid. And it's like, they look kind of weird. And Jeff Bridges is just, you can tell he's just having so much fun with this the entire way through the movie. And I just love the way he plays Flint. The guy at the I.O. Tower has a dick on his head. That is all. Yeah, that's accurate. Best extra in the movie is the guy who jumps off of the Solar Sailor rather than getting rocked by Tron. That's literally word for word what I had written down. They passed over a giant Mickey head because it's a Disney movie. One thing that did kind of bother me, but again, this is kind of like when I talked about the Black Hole last week, and there was that scene in the Black Hole when they are discussing everyone kind of splits up, all the crew of the ship that have boarded the space station on the verge of a black hole, all split up, and they all discover different unnerving things about the crew of the ship. And then they all come together, and they're like, this is really weird, and they do that. And I said it's kind of reminiscent of a scene in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And I feel like I've seen this scene before in other places, but I don't know if this is the first place it's been. This is how this feels with this thing, with the stereotype that it's a chess program that becomes a killer AI. It feels like this has been done before. And I've seen this happen since. But because I'm going back and watching a movie from 1981, I can't fault the movie for doing that because this may be the example that started the one that started the stereotype. It's like getting mad at Spider-Man for the stereotype being that someone got bit by a radioactive X and then they got their powers. They made that joke on what's it called, where it's a stereotype. Like on Fairly Odd Parents when they did the origin for the Crimson Chin, he got his powers when he got bit on the chin by a radioactive actor, and like that's just a thing now. When it's like really there was one character who that happened to, and it's Spider-Man. He got bit by a radioactive spider. But again, that's just a small thing. The return of color to the grid after Flynn and Tron defeat the MCP is the best effect shot in the movie. Yeah, that's pretty easy. I'm going to skip the Kingdom Hearts assessment because it's like... and the final shot of the city time lapse as people move in their cars is a great symbolic ending to show that people now, even with the new, with the grid and with the new technology, people are the programs. I really liked that ending where it kind of showed that people were starting to fall into the same things as the programs that were living in the grid. Now, let's jump to the sequel. The sequel being Tron Legacy, which I watched last night. And when I say I watched last night, I watched half of it and fell asleep. Here's the thing. There is CGI that ages poorly that happened within the last few years. There's CGI in the last few years that looks really, really great. An example of CGI that aged poorly in the last few years, if you go back and watch The Avengers, the CGI in the first Avengers movie, especially if you watch it upscaled to 4K, does not hold up. If you look at the CGI in, the CGI in Iron Man doesn't hold up. That said, this one has a lot of that. The opening of the movie is great because it basically explains to you what the previous movie is. It's an old Stan Lee adage that every comic is someone's first. I may be misattributing that to Stan Lee, but in the grand scheme of things, that would not be the first thing that's been misattributed to Stan Lee. Every comic is someone's first. You want to jump on. That's why, like the CW shows, when they every episode opens like a comic book. My name is Barry Allen. I'm the fastest man alive, and then it very quickly sums up to you the story so far. Where it's like I was struck by a bolt of lightning, and now I have speed. I'm looking for this happened. Now they are bad guys. Now I got to stop the bad guys. That brings you all up to speed. I was on Lian Yu for 5 years. Then I was in hell for 5 years. Then I finally escaped and came back to save my city. My wife and daughter were killed by a murderous tyrant. Now I'm going to stop. I've gathered a team of people from across the world to stop that from happening. It's designed to bring you in up to speed quickly, and now you know what's happening. The same thing happens here, in a sense, where they open up, they explain what Flynn did in the previous movie, how it worked, and then what ended up happening with that. The de-aging technology, however, atrocious, because the movie opens with a flashback to 1989, and we have a CGI de-aged Jeff Bridges, who, here's the issue with this movie. This de-aged Jeff Bridges, because not only is there Jeff Bridges there, but there's also a de-aged Jeff Bridges in the grid, who is Clue. I actually had that in my notes. I have, why in the hell did I need to make Jeff Bridges look younger? The only thing I could think is that the yellow Jeff Bridges is actually a corrupted version of Clue, and then the next thing is called it, because in that scene they reveal that too. It opens up explaining the previous movie, but the issue is you don't need the flashback, because that adds screen time we don't necessarily need, because there's a lot of information that's conveyed in the opening of this movie that I was kind of like, why? Like, this didn't need to be here. And that's a lot of this movie is like, what is this adding to the story? Like, you don't need to show him meeting with his dad, talking to his dad. It doesn't have any impact unless there's something in the second half of the movie that it does have to do with, but I didn't get that far yet. That said, the de-aging technology gets used a lot here, and it doesn't look good. As did the base jumping CGI after Sam goes to goes and leaks NCOM's thing online. And then another thing that I didn't like about this movie is when he goes back to the arcade and he turns it on and it plays It plays Separate Ways by Journey. It feels like needle drop moments in a movie should have a purpose. Like in that scene, yes, that's used to establish that this hasn't really been touched since the 80s, but at the same time, there was a better way to do that. That would that would feel more organic. I mean, simply showing the arcade in with dust all over it should have done it, and it doesn't really add much to the movie to play that song, and that song probably cost a lot of money too. That could have been used on de-aging Jeff Bridges better. Here's the thing. There's also a lot of dismemberment in this movie. Sam versus Rensler is a pretty good fight. Interestingly, the light cycle fights are all very fun to watch. But here's the thing. When we finally get to the grid, it's not the same grid from last time. It is substantially different, and you can't recognize it as the grid. And I get it. It's been 30 years, and they've been working on making the grid a place for programs and users to work together. It makes sense that it would look different. But at the same time, it looks too real at times. And it looks kind of like... I don't think it quite meshes well with what the tone... Like, the characters look similar to what they should... Like, if you're going to do this movie, if you're going to make a sequel to Tron, people liked Tron for what it was. If this may have been what you wanted to do in 1981, had the technology been there in 1981, this may have been what you wanted the grid to look like. But now we know it's not. We know what the grid looked like then. You want to have both, and there are shots that are very obviously designed as like homages to the original. And it's like little references, subtle nods to the audience, but I don't think that they tried to have their cake and eat it too. I think it's the best way to put it. They don't really assess what it was that made the movie work the first time, and therein lies the problem, I think, and why this movie ultimately failed. And we'll touch on this more next week. After I see the second half of the movie, but that was just when I started watching it last night, and I saw the grid for the first time, and I saw what they were doing in the grid, and I was like, it kind of struck me that this makes sense now as to why it didn't work. I see it now. Had they waited until now that we have the de-aged technology in just about every Marvel movie, there's a flashback with de-aged something or other, or in the case of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, a CGI de-aged. Not even CGI. It was practical effect de-aged Kurt Russell. You didn't need to have that happen. Would it have been harder? Probably. But I refuse to believe it wouldn't have been. It probably could have waited a little bit and it would have been better received if it looked better. Or don't use that at all. Like, don't use... Like, there is no... Like... You can keep it as of right now. I don't see a narrative reason, but I'm only halfway through the movie. But it could there could be a better use for the CGI de-aging or a better way to have implemented it. So yeah, that's Tron and Tron Legacy. We will finish up Tron Legacy next week when we talk about that. Two other stories I wanted to talk about. Number one, the comic industry is hit a little bit of a road bump. Because of the coronavirus. Diamond Distributors is currently not distributing comics, and Marvel and DC are not distributing comics through their apps. Here's the thing. I don't want to call for anyone to go out of business, because anytime people lose their jobs, that's not great. That said, I don't think it would be the worst thing on the planet for a complete shakeup of the comics industry with how comics are distributed. And I've talked about that before. I was listening to Penn Jillette. I think he was on an episode of Smodcast, and then Kevin Smith went over to that one. and they were talking about how he was talking about how his son doesn't have interest in what's it called? He doesn't have interest in going into magic, following his father's footsteps and going into magic. His daughter does. And when you think about it, if you start thinking about the famous magicians of the world, they're all men. Penn Jillette, Houdini. It's a male-dominated industry. And he's talking about why that was. If you're going to learn the art, you need to go to a club where people talk about what they do, and you learn from other people who did it before you. And because of that, the environment being male dominant and all that, it wasn't an environment that was welcoming to women. Now that YouTube's a thing and there's all these other ways that people can learn, you're seeing more women go on. So if you watch Penn and Teller Fool Us on CW, which I love that show's hilarious. If you watch that show, you'll see more women going on. You'll see more women illusionists going on like America's Got Talent and all these other reality shows. And the reason why that is now that anyone can learn it. Anyone there's that gatekeeper has gone. That gatekeep still exists on the comic industry because I'm a guy, and I can tell you one of the least welcoming places I've ever been is a local comic book store or a GameStop or anything like that. When you have someone there who's judging you based on what you're buying and someone who's there and they're considered to be someone of knowledge, and it's like I've heard people talk about the aspect of the curator, that comes with like the video store, where it's like the person there knows movies, is going to tell you what's there. When you go into a comic book store, I went into a local comic book store by me. This was probably like 10 years ago at this point. My one and only experience with a local comic book store, because I have not gone back. I go to a Newberry Comics now when I buy my comics, if I'm not buying them on the app. When you go to Newberry Comics, they sell so much stuff there. No one's looking at you funny for buying comics, and no one's going to judge you for it. When I went in there, I used to play Yu-Gi-Oh! In high school. And Shonen Jump every month would put out a magazine, and there would be a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card in there occasionally. This month, the card that they put in there was the Winged Dragon of Ra, a tournament legal version that you could have. And I was like, oh crap, I need that right now. So I went to a supermarket. They didn't have it there. I was like, okay, great. I'll go to the comic book store because it's a comic. It's not an American comic, but it's a comic nonetheless. So in my head, it made sense. I go in. I'm looking around the store, and I go up to the counter. The guy's got like and I figured I was on the right track because he had like the Dragon Ball action figures and stuff like that behind the counter. And I go over. I'm like, hey, do you have Shonen Jump? And the guy snorts at me. He's like, what the hell are you talking about? We don't sell that garbage here. And I'm like, all right, whatever. And since then, I haven't gone back to that store. It's not a huge deal, but I've been to GameStops where there's been guys working and they're talking and they're judging what the women are buying, and it's a similar thing. Newberry Comics, you lose that. And I've seen women buying comics at Newberry Comics, and they don't get harassed, they don't get bothered, they don't have to deal with someone going in. And this is not an ad for Newberry Comics. But that's how that ends up happening, where it's like you no longer have to deal with that. And if it's designed to stress you out, it's designed to keep you from liking, designed to keep you from reading it. Because at the end of the day, they don't want to. What was I saying? But that's and the reason why this has existed is because Diamond Comics distributors exist. And Diamond Comics, for those of you who don't know, is a company that Marvel puts out a comic. We'll use Marvel as an example. They put out a comic. They write it. They make it. It goes over to Diamond. Diamond then distributes it to the various other places. Now, when you read sales ranks about comics, these omit digital sales. Digital sales are not properly reported. And what ends up happening is when you read, oh, this comic's not selling well, this one's not selling well, this one's not selling well, and then they don't get canceled, what you're reading is these comics aren't being bought in stores, these comics aren't being bought by one specific subset of the audience that feels comfortable enough to go into a comic book store and buy a comic without fear of being judged. Because I feel like now, if I went into a comic book store and I picked up a new comic, no matter what it was, I feel that I wouldn't have the judgment that if, say, my sister went in and picked up the same comic, she would get questioned about or, have to deal with that too. And again, we can't use right now as an example because there's a pandemic going on. And I think that that's the big concern that, at the end of the day, Marvel and DC and Image and TKO and all these other companies just want to sell comics. That's all that matters. They just want people to buy the comics. At the same time, they can't leave the local comic book stores out to dry out of fear that, digital comics do make up a small section of the sales. They can't migrate fully to digital. People still want to have the physical comic in their hand, and they want to be able to, sell it as a commodity later on. But there's still a market for variants and things like that, and that's the concern. They don't want to lose that out to digital. But that said, Diamond has way too much power over the industry. Because there's no reason that Marvel and DC this week shouldn't have put out their comics on digital, the new ones that were coming out. Because now it's just like they're willingly taking a monetary hit right now purely because Diamond isn't distributing the comics. And it's like, no, we're not going to put it out. So now they're not producing anything at all. All of the writers and the artists and everything have been told they're not working. Because it comes down to Diamond does not want to distribute the comics, so no one can have a comic now. It's bizarre. I don't know how we got to this point, but they've put too much. The industry is too reliant on the local comic book store, and I think that if we look at it and we put it in perspective, let me put it into another way. Magazines, periodicals, and books and stuff that you buy at drugstores, at Walmart, and things like that, they're distributed by outside companies. I know for a lot of New York, it's Hudson News is the distributor. They drop it off, a merchandiser comes in, puts them on the shelf. It's all nice, fun and games. No, like Hearst Publishing or Meredith or anything like that, they aren't reliant on Hudson News. Where if Hudson News says, we're not delivering anything right now, so you guys can't put out something on digital, they're going to laugh at them and be like, okay, buddy, and that'll be the end of it. It's a truly bizarre situation that we should really be evaluating, or not we, because it's like we don't, us, me, and I would assume the majority of the audience don't work in the comics industry to the point where they, do that. But it's like the fact that we're, like, people are rooting for, here's what I don't get about people who, who are against more people reading comics. And it's like, why? How does it impact you if someone who is not you reads the comic? It's like, I read I saw a tweet, someone tweeted at Phil Spencer when some game went multi-platform and said, great, I destroyed my game now. And he's like, so you're mad that someone else can play that game. So you destroyed your game and denied yourself it. That makes no sense. And that's exactly what this is. It's like, oh, I like something, but I don't like it if other people like it. That's like, you're just being an asshole then. So I think that, like, what needs to happen is we need to address that situation urgently. Like, I think that what needs to happen is Hudson News should be counterbidding, or whatever distribution company exists in other parts of the country. Cause I don't know the other parts of the country. I guess, I'm from New York. We have Hudson News, and they're our magazine distributor. Like, yeah, you may lose the action figures and stuff because they don't have the infrastructure to do that. But for a while, when I was working upstate, we were getting Superman comics every week or every month. We got the new Superman comic, and I read the comic where Superman, when he gets solar flare, because we were selling it at work and I was able to get it there, and I didn't, have to go to a comic book store. Like Walmart, I don't think Walmart's getting those comics that they put out from Diamond, unless Diamond's doing a special order just for that. So I think that Diamond needs to go by the wayside. If there's any company I understand it that they don't want the optics of leaving out to dry Diamond. They don't want the optics of leaving out to dry the local comic book store because that's bad press they don't want to deal with. But time to adapt. The comic book industry needs to change, and this is exactly the catalyst that needs to happen. So, if I work for Hudson News, or if anyone out there works for Hudson News, maybe see if you can get someone to be like, "Hey, we'll distribute the comics for you." Because look, if Hudson News were to put spinner racks back in stores, and it just had comics from Marvel and DC, and like put a few from Image out, that would, like, in a supermarket, that would be a perfect thing to help generate income. Because people who put them there, and the other comic books will still have variants, they'll still have action figures, they'll still have all kinds of other things, and they can have a wider selection. But just put like your top sellers in Stop and Shop, in ShopRite, Price Shopper, just that way that you're still able to do that, because the comic industry should not, on paper, the comic industry should not have been able to shut down in the way it did in this pandemic. Because I feel like for certain we're still going to be getting magazines. Magazines are still going to exist. I got a new Time magazine this week. So I don't know. That's just my opinion, though. There was something else I wanted to talk about, but I forgot what it was. We'll probably just put it off till next week. I'll probably remember it at some point between now and next week, and I'll write it down for a change. Next week's movie, I have quite a few movies queued up on Hulu, possible. I also have a bunch of movies queued up on, what's it called? On Disney Plus. I don't know what I'm going to watch next, but I will tweet it out when we figure out what we're doing for next week's episode. I do have, if you want to support the show, go to myecbu.com, go down to the bottom and sign up for Gamefly, especially now that we're all on quarantine. If you go down to the bottom, there's a Gamefly link. Click the link, sign up, get your 2-week trial. We get paid. What else do I have? If you want to also support the show, on Amazon, I have 2 books on pre-order coming out at the end of April. The first one is the final book from the Swan Song trilogy called The Muses, and the other book is a entirely new one. I anticipated releasing it in I anticipated entering it in contests, but I missed the deadline due to circumstances outside of my control. So I have elected instead to just release it the way I would release any other book. It's called Your Past Does Not Define You. It is a story of a team of former villains from, like, they're not actual they're my characters, but they're villains from various they have powers. They all have to team up to stop a terrorist attack that's going to happen. It's interesting. I started writing. And these are probably some of my favorite characters that I've written so far. That will be coming out. They was coming out the last week in April. And yeah, I got 3 other books this year too. On top of that, I got Excellence. I have Taser and Acrobat, and I have Dreamscapes all coming out at the end of this year. And we're building towards something big. This is going to be a very interesting way of doing what I've been looking into, what I've wanted to do for a long time. I can't do it theatrically because I lack the effects budget and the cast and the budget to do really anything. And I don't want to end up like the Immortal Wars. So I'm just releasing the scripts myself and we'll see where it goes from there. So if you want to support the show, on my Twitter account at AdamTaylor792, there is a There is a link in the pinned tweet to buy some of my books. You can check that out there. So we'll be back next week with another new movie we're watching, and we will eventually do our tournament of movies. I just want to, get together and watch all the movies that are on the list before we get to that point. So we'll be back with all of that next Thursday, same time, same place. Well, for the most part, same time, but same place we always have it. And next week we'll be starting our giveaways. I do have some movies to give away, some ultraviolets that I have not used, so I'll be giving those away on the show as well. So have a great rest of your week.